Today we are diving into a new section of the class where we're looking at the rise of empires. While we've looked at some civilizations in the past, the Chavin culture, for example, and the Nazca culture, that have risen to great heights, prominence, and influence, particularly in the way that their cultural ideas and artwork have been disseminated. This stepped up a level when we looked at the Olmec, as you will hear and read again and again that it is thought by many that the Olmec culture is the basis of much of Mesoamerican society and culture. That is contested, but nonetheless, the groups we're looking at today really made a major pivot. The population size, the land acquisitions that we're talking about here become monumental on the level of today's nation states. So with that in mind, we're also jumping forward in time. We are now in the 11th to 15th. Nope, I do that wrong every time. We're now we're between 1100 and 1500 of our current era. You know, this is about 600-700 years ago at the end of this empire. So we're moving up in scale, we're moving forward in time, and we're doing that today through first the Chan site, which was dominated by the Chimú, and then we will begin to look at the empire of the Inca, and we'll continue that in the next lecture as well. Let's take a second to think about what else is happening at this time period. Between 1200 and 1400 CE, for example, in North America, we have the Hopi people and their incredible cliff dwellings. You can see that image in a tiny version on the right, the way that they have carved into the stone. They are creating tectonic architecture in these beautiful, defensive, communal ways. And then in South America, as we'll see today, we're looking at the Chimú people, particularly the citadels at Chan, and then the Inca. All of this is happening at the same time in history. What that means is that in terms of ecological engineering, this way of thinking through the Anthropocene, this way of humans manipulating the environment around them, we are stepping things up quite a bit. Today, the Chimú that we're looking at are in desert conditions on the coast of what is now Peru. And responding to that, they are creating irrigation canal systems, water reserves, and advanced modes of agriculture, fishing, and trade. Just keep your eye on this graph chart to do a little comparison between the Chimú and the Inca in terms of where they are and what's happening at the time. All right, Chan, this is one of these fabulous, just amazing sites that get very little attention, not enough attention at all. Built in the 13th century, Chan stands as the most extant set of remains from the highly advanced Chimú culture. And unlike the Nazca that we studied in Peru from preceding centuries, the Chimú people's work, seen here at Chan, has been damaged over the centuries, badly damaged by El Niño's floods and heavy rainfall. The result of what was once a 9 square mile, it's not quite a city, it's a group of citadels, is so badly eroded. It's the archaeological work that's being done there to uncover what happened is very intensive, because if you looked at pictures of this on the web, there's very little left. It's just the nature of adobe that it decays under wind and water. What we do know about Chan, however, is it's incredibly hierarchical, and their architecture is driven by both that hierarchy and the political systems, which brought forth highly organized city or site with very clear planning and advanced engineering. At Chan Chan's peak, it was the largest adobe city on Earth. It was the capital of the Chimú people and home to approximately 60,000 different citizens at its height. The ruling seat of the Chimú Empire, Chan Chan amassed vast quantities of gold, silver, ceramics, and they acquired these, of course, through tribute and taxes. The remainder, what was not pillaged, what was not taken, remains at the museum on site at Chan Chan. All right, where are we? We are here in the coastal valley of northern Peru, this bump out that occurs in South America. We've just seen, if we were looking at this through a historical lens, we would have seen the collapse of the Wari kingdom around 1000 CE, and this opened up space for a new, larger group to take over. The capital for the Chimú is here in the desert. All right, you're gonna tell me it's not a desert because of those green spots, but that is largely the result of both a river coming down from the mountains, but primarily what you're seeing here is just modern agriculture with incredible intensive watering and irrigation. You can see from the rest that it is decidedly a kind of coastal desert. All right, let's zero in. What we're about to see is a form of architecture that we have not seen before. And it's a form of architecture that revolves around two different sets of beliefs. One, dealing with the religious sphere, specifically the existence of a particular type of afterlife. And the other influence on the architecture of this space has to do purely with the very human realm of human pride and the collection and protection of turf and goods. The Chimú believe that their kings continue to live even after death, and this really impacts the way that they build. When a new king took over, they didn't take the palace that their predecessors had. They built a new one right next to it. The previous predecessor, that's redundant. Okay, the previous ruler kept all of their wealth, all of their people, family, very intense amounts of forced labor here, their servants, the people who were paid to work for them. This whole group stayed inside the former palace, and a whole new group was set up and brought to the second space. These new, each one is called a citadel. So that second citadel began to emerge from the place where the last ruler took off. As you're beginning to see from the images, the citadels are largely rectilinear, right? They're made out of squares and rectangles, 90-degree angles. What you're seeing here is one of the best restored citadels so far, but don't be fooled by those roof kind of tent-like spaces out there. Those are new construction to protect the archaeological digs below. They're just like roofs so that wind, rain, water, etc. don't get in and mess up what's happening with the dig site. All right, let's see this in a sort of site plan. Each of those grayed in rectangles is an individual citadel. It represents the palace structure of one particular king of the Chimú. Each one is surrounded by massive walls, 50 foot high, sometimes 60 feet high, in fact. And you can see from the image here just how thick they are. If that wall is 50 feet high, the depth of the wall is going to be at least 20 feet deep, sometimes up to 30 and 40 feet deep. We've looked at wall structures before, we've thought about their meaning and their intent, but one doesn't build walls of this type unless you're protecting something incredibly valuable within. Sure, it's a show of force and ability and architectural prowess, but it's also, there's wealth inside there that they are working to protect. As you might have noticed on the last image, there were a series of kind of animal-like carvings at the base of the wall. And we see amongst the Chimú people here at Chan Chan that there are two styles of carving. One is a realistic representation, which you see kind of in the lower right of the image, this sort of maybe a seagull, a seabird. And then there is this more graphic, more abstract. For us, it looks digitized because it has all these kind of squared off pieces that look like pixels that you see on the left of the image. Across the sites at Chan Chan, lots of different animal figures, lots of different abstracted figures show up, and they're used to denote exactly what's happening in the space you're viewing. We'll look at this in more detail in a second. So as I mentioned, right now we're looking at 10 different citadels. These are the citadels that have been excavated and protected at Chan Chan. They can either be called citadels or ciudadelas, depending on whether you are speaking Spanish or English. Here we're looking at the Rivero Citadel. Inside each citadel are a series of courtyards, one immense courtyard, as we've seen, for holding court, exactly as the name implies. The king would come out, speak to a large group of people who would fit in that enclosure, or those people would gather to pay tribute or praise to the king themselves. Beyond that large courtroom, there's a palace in every single one of these citadels, and there are immense spaces used as storerooms, and of course passageways between the storerooms. What we're looking at here again is this magnificent series of walls. Here they're 4 meters thick, which is 12 feet approximately thick at the base of the wall, and they taper off to about 3.5, 4 feet thick at the very top. They're just huge. Okay, the point of the wall, as archaeologists and art historians have shown us, they don't seem to be military. They weren't indestructible in that way, but they are purely socioeconomic. Along with these adobe walls, there were mud-plastered logs covered by reeds, which made up some smaller interior walls, and most of the citadels had a kind of mud-plastered flooring, which is quite an advance over dirt floors or grass floors. All right, let's look at Rivero in detail. Take a minute. Tell me in Slack what it is that we're looking at. What do you see when you look at this image? Just pause for a minute and do all that. A few things that stand out, right, are again these very rectilinear spaces. There are no circles here. There are very few rounded edges. The ones that show up in the upper part of this drawing, in fact, denote spaces within the storerooms. The formal spaces are all very square with tiny cubes within other larger cubes. That's a choice, right? It's always a choice. So there is something highly planned, something highly efficient about this. You maximize space with a square as long as you can get things into the corners. So as you can see in this image, right, the very back of this perspective, we have these high mountains, which are the beginning of the Andes. We're down on the coastline. So between the person taking the photograph, and the Andes, we have those massive Chimú walls. And then in front, we have a series of deteriorated walls. The adobe here, and this was all made out of adobe mud brick, is arranged in this kind of net-like shape. It's a series of diamond patterns. Those diamond patterns created airflow through each of these different storerooms and passageways. It's not quite air conditioning, but it's a very smart way to increase circulation in what would otherwise become stuffy, moldy spaces, right? The walls that you're seeing have deteriorated, but they would have risen up at least 10 feet tall in this beautiful, almost like gingerbread pattern, right? The spaces of the citadels, of course, were the spaces of the elite, the powerful, those who could and did garner all of this tribute, all this praise, vast amounts of wealth, and also chose to harness the people there, the Chimú people, for their own ends. We don't know quite enough about the Chimú to understand whether this was enslavement, whether this was a paid system, whether there was honor in working for them. But we always know in a power hierarchy, right, choice isn't always choice. Another thing we know about the Chimú is that in addition to these grand spaces, there are more impoverished forms of architecture where you can see that less long-lasting materials, things that would deteriorate faster, materials that would have been much cheaper, more accessible, required less labor at the time. These impoverished areas of Chan Chan indicate a clear presence of inequality based on the living arrangements and residential areas alone. This is just one more way that architectural history tells us something about a culture that we don't have in written form. While at Chan Chan's height, it housed over 60,000 people, it would soon be subsumed into the world of the Incas that we will examine shortly. I want to leave you with one spectacular image of one of the citadels at Chan Chan. Up in the far left, you can see the shape of the adobe bricks that would have been underneath this plaster layer. So all of the brickwork, all of the labor, all of the drying of adobe, which is usually a combination of mud and some sort of grass or straw, which gives it strength. That straw acts like a carbon fiber, in fact, and reinforces the brick itself, keeps it from collapsing under pressure. Then this beautiful plaster exterior, right, where we have a series of anthropomorphic images, something that looks like possibly a human form, surrounded by, they almost look like sea monkeys in the middle, and that's not too far off. The Chimú did believe that there were sea monsters out in the water right off of the coast. So we have this whole world being explicated here on the side of the wall.